Frans Skovholm from DAHL Advokatfirma. We're looking forward to hearing much more about that, so please join us on stage and give him a round of applause. Thank you very much. Welcome, Frans.
Thank you very much. I like that you started with saying we're going to have fun with NIS2. That's quite seldom that, but let's try to have some fun with this NIS2. My name is Frans Skovholm. I am a lawyer and partner in the Danish law firm called DAHL Law Firm. I'm working with information security law, and as part of that, of course, NIS2, the DORA regulation, and in the different aspects of this security, also when it comes to personal data. And I know some of you might think, okay, what about the OT? But I know that OT and IT will be more and more, yes, as there'll be some of the regulations, which I'll come back to, that will be quite interesting for both IT and OT. But when we are going through the NIS2 agenda, we'll start with looking into how is the regulation today and what can we expect. And of course, what kind of manufacturing companies will be subject to NIS2. After that, we'll go into some of the minimum requirements that you have to comply with if you're a NIS2 subject. And in the end, we'll look into something about the part about security breaches, the role of the management, fines, and then we'll end with some practical things about how you can get started with working with your NIS2. And of course, some questions in the end as well. But if we look into the regulation, then this Net Information Security Directive from EU had the purpose to ensure that our critical infrastructure was protected in a way that could be strong enough against all the threats that we see out there. In 2018, we also had the GDPR. So the first NIS1 directive was, so to speak, standing in the shadow of GDPR. Many of the companies that were subject to this NIS1 directive wasn't aware of it, and many of these companies didn't comply with the NIS1 regulation. Because of that, the EU Commission decided to upgrade the NIS1 to a NIS2 directive. And as a part of this upgrading, the cyber defense and the security, they also had some other regulations. In the financial sector, we had the DORA. I know if some of you maybe have heard about that. It's a regulation and not a directive. So when we're talking about regulations, it's the EU Commission who is setting out the requirements, where when we have this directive, there is a lot of space for the EU member to set their own requirements. Beside that, we also have this, this CERT directive, which is, as I mentioned before, it's a directive. So there's a lot of space left for each competent authority to set out the legislation to regulate under the NIS2. As a supplement for this regulation, we have some regulations from the EU Commission that set out some minimum requirements, and that is regarding the
Yeah. Get the back.
That is regarding the IT entities, as when we look into the sectors, it could be cloud computing, managed service providers, and so on. And these minimum directives, minimum requirements, came in the middle of October. And they are quite important when we shall look into what kind of requirements, when we work with OT, should we be aware of. Because the way that we have the regulation in Denmark is we have this NIS2 law that will come next summer. And as a part of this NIS2 law, we will have sector legislation. As I'll come back to, if I ever will come back to my slides again, we have a lot of different sectors. Yes, perfect. Wow. We have this sector legislation. That is the sector legislation in Denmark for manufacturing. And as I'll come back to, when we look into this sector legislation, it's not ready yet. It's all delayed. We had this new ministry that is working on who shall be the competent authorities for the different sectors and so on. But this sector legislation for manufacturing will be the legislation that you'll have to look into when you look into OT. This one, this regulation. Sorry. No. Yeah. For the IT, the cloud, the cloud computing and so on. I'll just stay over here. Is quite important because it's a very good place to be to get some insights of what can we expect of the new requirements in our sector. I'll come back to that. When we have to look into whether our company will be a subject to NIS2, there are two steps we have to take. The first one is, do our company have a size that has an impact on the critical infrastructure? And when we have to assess whether or not we are big enough to have an impact on the critical infrastructure, we have to look into, are we a small company? Back in 2003, the EU Commission made a recommendation where they defined what is a small company. And a small company is a company with less than 50 persons and with an annual turnover or balance sheet for under these 10 million euros. So if you're not a small company, if you have more than 50 persons, and if you are having an annual turnover balance sheet over these 10 million euros, then you're big enough to have an impact on the critical infrastructure. That was the first step. Then we have to take the next step, and that is, are we in a sector that is critical? Is this sector a part of the critical infrastructure in Europe and in Denmark? And when we have to define that, we can look into the annex to the NIS2 Directive, where we have the essential entities and we have the important entities. All these sectors, as I started with, will have their own sector legislation. They will have their own competent authorities who will monitor whether these companies are complying with the NIS2 law. The difference between the essential and the important entities is two things, so to speak. The first one is the risk of getting higher fines is much higher for an essential entity than an important entity. And the regulation, we must expect that the regulation for the essential entities will be more will be more than for the important entities. And then you can see here, with not touch it, but with these important entities, we have the manufacturing. And if we look into the definition of manufacturing, then the method is that when you look into this annex to the NIS2 Directive, you go down to this annex and say, okay, what is manufacturing? And then these types of manufacturing will occur. Then under these types of manufacturing, you will have to look into some other regulation or some other directive where they have defined what kind of manufacturing that will be a part of the critical sector. So it's not just to say, oh, because we are manufacturing something that maybe could be a machinery or equipment, then I think we'll be subject. You have to go through and see, okay, what is the definition of manufacturing of machinery and so on in the regulation that that is defining this kind of manufacturing. Yes. As I started with, in the NIS2 Directive, all the subjects, all the companies, entities who will be part of the NIS2, subject to NIS2, are obliged to registrate themselves to the competent authorities. And then, of course, some might think, okay, if we don't registrate, then we'll maybe not be a part of the NIS2. But no, it's not. The requirement of registration has nothing to do with whether or not you're a NIS2 subject. If you're not registering that to the competent authority, you'll still be subject to NIS2. On the other hand, if you are by mistake registering your company to the competent authority, and it afterwards shows that your sector is not critical, or you're not having any impact on the society because you're a small company, then the authorities will go back and say, okay, please withdraw this registration. You're not a part of the NIS2. So this registration is only a requirement to ensure that the companies have an insight on what companies do we have to be aware of relating to NIS2. Then we have this direct or indirect subject to NIS2. I don't know if you have heard about it. Or are we direct, are we indirect subject to NIS2? In my opinion, either you're subject to NIS2 or you're not. Because many of these suppliers who think, oh, we are indirect subject to NIS2, also have some kind of misunderstanding, or where do we have to look into the NIS2 directive to see what requirements we have to comply with and so on. But there are no NIS2 requirements for these suppliers who are indirect subject to NIS2. The only thing that they have to be aware of is their contract with their customer. So, just to be very clear, there's either you're a subject to NIS2 or you're not. Yeah. Then we're looking into these minimum security requirements. All subjects to NIS2 shall document that they have some measures that support these types of security. The different kind of measures could be risk assessment, policies, technology controls, documentation, contracts clauses, awareness. And that is both if you're talking IT and OT. When you have to determine how you want to implement these requirements, then you have to be aware of, again, 2 steps. The first step is your risk assessment. I know when you're working with OT, you know a lot about risk assessments. And the other step is to look into what kind of minimum requirements do we need to comply with in all of these areas. If we look into the risk assessment, then for those of you who also may have worked a little bit with the GDPR, maybe. It needs to be appropriate and proportionate, these measures that we implement. So when we are looking into what kind of technical and operational measures that we need to implement, then we have to make sure that the level of security is appropriate to the risk. When we look into the minimum requirements, as I mentioned before, the legislation for manufacturing in Denmark is not in place. So instead of just saying, come back in 3 months, then we have some other content that we should look into when we are trying to setting forth what kind of requirements should we work with. And this regulation from the EU Commission regarding, as I mentioned before, cloud computing, managed service, and so on, this is minimum requirements that the EU Commission has set, although this is a directive, and although that the authorities in the EU member states can set their own requirements, then they minimum have to implement these requirements concerning cloud computing, managed service, and so on. I think that when the competent authorities in Denmark are looking into minimum requirements, then this will have a lot of impact on how the Danish authorities will implement the Danish rules. So if we look into it, then of course this is not for OT, but let's try to see how it could be, and let us inspire of some of these requirements. The first one is incident handling. Incident handling, how many of you are working with that in an OT environment? Yeah. So a lot of you should sit down and look into this, because it will be an important part of your OT work. Another thing, backup. Today, how many of you can see a requirement is storing backup copies online or offline in a safe location or locations which are not in the same network as the system, and there are sufficient distance to escape any damage from a disaster in the main site. How many of you does that today? Have a yeah. But you'll need to look into maybe some other kind of solutions, because these requirements, in my opinion, will also apply to OT. Then we have security and network, also something that you work with. And then we have the supply chain. And I think no matter if you're talking IT, you're talking OT, in general manufacturing, then you have to work with your critical suppliers in the same way. When you're working with your suppliers, no matter, of course, if it's ET or IT, you have to go through these steps for all your critical suppliers. You need to start with document your risk assessment of your supplier. And when we look into the requirements, you have to risk assess the quality of the product, the service level, and of course the information security, the way they work with information security. Then you go on, you have accepted the vendor, and now you can enter a contract with this vendor. Then again, you have to be aware of the minimum requirements that you need to have in your contract with this vendor. It's not the vendor, as I mentioned before, he's indirect. So he will only look into the contract. So when he comes with the contract to you and say, this is best practice, this is the contract I have with all my customers, if it's not complying with the NIS2 requirements, you have a problem. Not the vendor, not the supplier, it's you. Then when you have entered your contract, you need to monitor. And when you monitor, you have to ensure that you have maybe some kind of audit, you have an auditor report, and so on. And then following up on the service levels as well, so following up on the quality of the products. And at the end of the contract, you need to ensure that you have the right terms concerning termination, and when you, in the end, have to store, maybe document some of the information you have from the supplier, you also have to regulate how you want to do that. This is the same way if you build it as a project. Then I would today start with looking into which of my suppliers are critical. And then I will make a risk assessment of all my critical suppliers. I'll look into the contracts with the suppliers, and then I'll screen them for these minimum requirements, and then start up the negotiation. And I know that it's not until next summer that it will force the Danish NIS2 law, but we need to be sure of that our suppliers will be compliant with us when we meet next summer with the new NIS2 law. Then of course we should have an annual cycle with all the controls and audits and so on. And then of course when we are looking forward, then we have to have a clearly process on how we onboard new suppliers to make sure that we have the right security in our supply chain. For those of you who have customers that are NIS2 subjects, then I would recommend that you look into your customer database and try to assess, okay, how many of these of our customers will be subject to NIS2, and in what sectors are they? Because, as I mentioned before, we have this sector regulation, sector legislation. So it might be a good idea to be prepared when these different kind of sector customers come with their new requirements. Make some templates, negotiate when they come, and then have a process for how you onboard these NIS2 customers in the future. Security breaches. When we have critical security breaches, one of the purposes with NIS2 is that we, in general, in Europe, have an insight on, okay, what sector is now under siege, where do we have some threats? And because of that, it's very important that if you are NIS2 subject, that you within 24 hours after you are aware of that you have this critical security breach, that you report it. And then you have to follow up within 72 hours and so on. When we look into the management's responsibility, there the EU Commission want the management to be an independent, responsible entity. So, if the EU Commission could make a decision on the management's responsibility, then the EU Commission wanted the management to be independent responsible, so to speak, that they could have a fine without the company necessary should have a fine. When we look into the draft of the Danish NIS2 law, I don't think that will be the case in Denmark. I think that the way that you will regulate the responsibility for the management in Denmark will be in the same way that you're working with management responsibility in general. But the management does anyway have an understanding of information security. They have to follow courses. They have to ensure that the employees also are educated, and then they have to approve all these measures that are implemented regarding NIS2. As I said to start with, one of the difference between the essential and the important entities are the fines. You see, they're a bit higher when it comes to the essential entities, and looks a bit like the fines that you can get relating to GDPR. If you look into NIS2 from a practical angle, then you need different kind of knowledges because the NIS2 operates with law, with IT/OT, and of course the management are also very important because they have to approve and ensure that there are awareness for the employees. So you should start with looking out for these different kind of competences with knowledge when you start your implementing process. Then I've highlighted the GDPR, and the reason why I've taken that with me is that it's directly mentioned in the NIS2 that if the competent authorities are because in a breach looking into your systems and aware of that you have compromised your personal data, then they will go to the Danish protection agency, and then you'll have two cases. You'll both have a case with the Danish protection agency and with the competent authority. So it's important to have focus on GDPR as well. And if you should put it in some swim lanes, then you have this management, you have this IT/OT and the contract part, like in many other projects, it's a very good idea to start with this NIS2 gap analysis, try to look into, see, okay, what kind of measures are we not focusing on today, what kind of measures should we have now we're looking into this regulation, and then begin with making a risk assessment on top of that, and after that, when you have determined your measures, you can start implementing it in the 3 lanes. Yeah.